Banks are an important tool in any nomad capitalist's toolbox. If you're going to be living offshore, even if you like to keep your money in hard assets like gold or real estate with minimum liquidity, even if you prefer to keep all your money in crypto, banks on both a personal level and a business level are going to be something that you will need to have to function on a day-to-day basis, buy property, make investments, and do business through your offshore companies. But yet, people want to know that the banks that they work with are safe. We feel comfortable with the banks in our home country. Even if we say we don't, we have a fundamental feeling of soundness because we know what they are. But the unknown, the overseas banks, many of which we've never heard of before, how do we know that they're safe? Well, I'm going to go through the list of the safest banks in the world. I'm going to tell you where they are. I'm going to tell you my thoughts. Hi, I'm Andrew Henderson, and here at Nomad Capitalist, we help 7- and 8-figure entrepreneurs legally go where they're treated best. That could mean finding safe banks around the world to protect their assets, lower their taxes through tax reduction strategies, increase their options by having second residences and passports that sometimes come from having bank accounts overseas. You can learn more at nomadcapitalist.com. And every year, the industry publication Global Finance comes out with a list of the safest banks in the world. I've been studying this for years. It's interesting stuff. They break it down by the best banks for everything from digital finance, the best apps, best banks by region, safest banks. But today I'm going to talk about, on a global level, the 50 safest banks in the world. Now, this report is updated every year, so it certainly changes from year to year. I've seen, and I'll talk about a couple of the changes that I've seen in the last couple of years, nothing substantial. Which is interesting. But the first thing you have to know about some of the safest banks on their list is many of them are not even the kind of banks that you would think about. They are banks that are agriculture banks, or they make loans to public companies, or they work pretty much exclusively with the government. So some of these banks aren't even retail banks where you can walk in and open an account. Of those that are, many of those will not open an account for you unless you live in their country or you have some kind of connection or you have a referral. So we're going to go through some of the options that are available to you. But first, let's start and let's discuss where these safest banks are. Out of the top 50, the country that comes up more than any other is Canada. There's 8 banks in Canada that are actually on this list. That includes pretty much all of the big 4, so banks like TD, RBC, Scotiabank, etc. Coming up after Canada, there are 7 banks in Germany, 4 banks in Australia, 4 banks in the United States. Now, all of those American banks are basically agriculture finance banks. I'd never heard of any of them, actually. Now, there was one year, I believe, that U.S. Bank was on the list. They're no longer on the list, but these 4 banks in the United States are probably not banks that almost anyone watching this would bank with. And so again, that is the challenge. If you're living in the United States, for example, I've told you that your banks are nowhere near the safest or best capitalized in the world. You may have a feeling of safety around those banks. And so here you do have 4 spots at the top 50, but they're not the kind of banks that you would typically bank with, either the big national banks or the small local banks. Some of the wild cards that come up: Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, Hong Kong. We see an increasing number of banks in places like Asia. There are some South Korean banks on the list. Certainly banks in Singapore, Hong Kong, you've got 1 or 2. And then the Gulf region is on there as well. Now, again, most of these are not retail banks, or they don't open for non-residents. That's particularly generally true in the Gulf. There are some conditions under which you can get an account in the UAE as a non-resident with a pretty minimal deposit. They're increasingly moving towards requiring priority accounts, and banks like Emirates MBD have raised their priority requirements and doubled them in their case. And so the Gulf, they're largely focused on employees. Hong Kong has been very difficult to deal with. The Gulf in general, pretty difficult to deal with, actually, like I said. A couple of the countries that stand out to me on this list are Singapore. They have raised their prices, as has the UAE, for non-residents, but still available if you have 6- or 7-figure sums to deposit. The local banks will do that. Some of the international banks will do that, although they generally want you to have a connection with them somewhere else. One thing we found actually is if you have a residence in certain countries, let's say in Asia, you've got a residence in Thailand or in Malaysia, and you've got a bank in that country, you can sometimes use the lower minimums in that country to go and jump to a place like Singapore and get a referral to their bank and bypass some of the higher minimums that they may otherwise have, if that's of interest to you. The UAE is on the list. Again, the price is generally going up, although obtaining a residence there isn't necessarily that difficult if you want to incorporate your company there. Canada also stands out depending on where you're from. Certainly they are U.S. friendly, and so that's a place you can go up and open an account. If I'm an American, I don't know entirely how much different Canada is in terms of changing my international banking profile. But those are countries that definitely stand out. Another wild card you can look at is a bank. Scotiabank's an example in the Caribbean, where obviously a Canadian bank, and they have these resources all over the Caribbean. It seems like those options are increasingly closing, where you have a connection to one part of the bank and you can open an account somewhere else in their network. But theoretically, that is an option. Now, out of those 50 banks, there's a pretty small number that will deal with you. Again, in most cases, there may be some loopholes where you get in for 10 grand or you get in for 50 grand. Those accounts are generally going to be more limited. So an account that you open in the UAE that's just a regular account, it may only be dirhams, or maybe dirhams and dollars. You may not have all the different multi-currency. Or in Singapore, you may be able to open an account on a case-by-case basis. It's some of the big three in the mid-five figures range, but it's generally only going to be in Singapore dollars, and you're not going to have the full suite of services. So if you can get into the mid-six figures, even the low six figures in some cases, these banks will be open to you. And generally I found that Asian banks can be more open than the European banks. So the Swiss banks, the German banks on this list, probably not ones that I would bank very highly on, unless I'm talking substantial assets. And then I still want to meet their profile. They're more particular in that way. Now, here's the thing. Probably the banks that you're banking with are also not on that list. In fact, probably they're nowhere close. You don't have really many retail banks in the US, barely any in the UK. Australia was the one country that actually has some of them on there. Now, if you're an Australian and you feel comfortable there, many Australians do feel comfortable banking in their home country, that's fine. Now, the challenge is if you want to go overseas, that is going to potentially get in the way of your tax reduction plans. And so you may be forced to find another bank. For people in many countries, when you go to leave your country and establish a tax home somewhere else, you're going to want to close those bank accounts. So even if you want to, even if you feel comfortable with the accounts in your home country, most of us shouldn't, you may need to close those eventually. And so the point is, my thought in going offshore is you have to take a bit more responsibility for yourself. You live in the United States. I remember, I still have images in my mind of being 4 or 5 years old. My father and I would go out for breakfast on Saturday morning, and sometimes after breakfast we would go to the bank. And they were open till 1 or 2 o'clock, and we would cash some kind of check my grandmother gave me or some dividend check or something. We'd put it in there, and they'd have the signs right there. I said, Dad, what's the FDIC, right? He said, oh, if the bank fails, you hope they'll give you your money back. The government will step in. They've got a fund, right? I think we've increasingly seen in the last 30 years how those funds and how the government are not as trustworthy as people once thought. And the banks themselves are not as well capitalized. They've got loan portfolios. In many cases, they've been too aggressive with their loan portfolios. And I think overseas banks are often more conservative. They take fewer risks than the banks in many of our home countries. And so if you're willing to do your due diligence, and if you're willing to not allow some government agency and a sign on a bank teller's desk to convince you that you're safe, then you can go out and you can run through the numbers. We do this. Now, we're not financial analysts, but we do go through some of the financial data on different banks. We look at some of the country-by-country data, which banks in Armenia, for example, are the safest, which have the best liquidity. And if you look at that, you will find banks in countries you've never heard of before, never even considered banking in before, that are safer than the bank that you're working with now. So the perspective is not what are the absolute safest banks in the world. Certainly a few of those will be accessible to you. And certainly the bank that's 51st or 62nd is not one that you necessarily want to ignore. But I feel pretty comfortable. I've never lost a single dollar overseas, knock on wood. Never lost a single dollar in the United States where I come from either, due to a bank failure. But I think that The whole idea of going offshore is you're a bit more responsible. You've got to know what kind of bank you're dealing with. Now, some of these banks, again, they may have branches in other countries, and so therefore, I would argue that a large international bank is not going to let one of their banks in one country go under. Even if it's separately chartered in that country, it's going to be a huge blow to their image. And I'm not going to mention any particular banks so that they come after me for mentioning them. But imagine a big Singaporean bank that does business around Asia, for example, or a big Malaysian bank that does business around Asia, or an American bank that has branches somewhere else. Are they going to want to have the negative reputation in their home country that would come from one of their smaller branches being shuttered? Of course not. But really, understanding where you're putting your money, understanding that many countries have safer banks than the ones where you come from, I think is the overall thing I want you to take from this list. If you don't bank with one of the countries on this list, or the banks on this list, go out and understand where you're banking, and don't let the idea of the unknown keep you from doing it. How can Nomad Capitalist help you? 4 ways. Number 1, subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell to make sure you get our new video every day. Number 2, get a copy of Nomad Capitalist, the book. You'll learn a lot of my personal experiences over a dozen years of studying this stuff, as well as exactly some of the strategies that you can use to build your Nomad Capitalist plan. Number 3, if you're not sure where to start, but you want to come and learn from my team and I, you want to come and mingle with like-minded people, learn more about our live conference, Nomad Capitalist Live. It's coming up soon. And number 4, if you want some help right now because you've got a burning issue, you need something solved, you want to lower your taxes, get a second passport, or build the Nomad Capitalist lifestyle of your dreams, go to nomadcapitalist.com and click on Become a Client.